In the winter of 1876, deep in the isolated mountains of Montana Territory, a German doctor named Theodor Brennan made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside a remote cabin, 23 miles from the nearest settlement, he found medical records that documented 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within a single Irish family. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Hidden beneath floorboards wrapped in oiled cloth were the preserved remains of 7 infants, all bearing identical deformities that marked them as unworthy of life according to their own parents. The Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide for over a century, eliminating any child born with visible genetic defects to maintain their carefully constructed facade of normalcy. What Dr. Brennan discovered next would challenge everything the medical community believed about heredity, family bonds, and the lengths people would go to protect their bloodline's dark secrets. The evidence he uncovered suggested that this wasn't an isolated case of frontier madness, but part of a deliberate genetic experiment that had been refined and perfected across generations, spanning 2 continents and nearly 100 years of carefully concealed family practices. Before we continue with the story of the Donnelly family and their horrific genetic legacy, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts worldwide. Your engagement helps us bring you more stories like this one, stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. The story Dr. Brennan would later document in his private journals began not in Montana's unforgiving wilderness, but in the rolling green hills of County Cork, Ireland, where the Donnelly bloodline first took its twisted turn toward genetic catastrophe during the harsh winter of 1798. The Montana Territory of 1874 represented the very edge of American civilization, a land where federal authority existed more in theory than practice. Helena, the territorial capital, boasted barely 8,000 souls clustered around the mining operations that had sparked the region's growth. The surrounding mountains held only scattered mining camps, isolated homesteads, and native tribes still actively resisting the encroachment of white settlers. It was a landscape carved by violence and shaped by desperation, where families could disappear for months without anyone asking questions, where the harsh winters claimed lives regularly, and where the territorial government's reach extended only as far as its scattered deputies could ride through treacherous mountain passes. The gold rush that had initially drawn settlers to Montana was beginning to wane by 1874, leaving behind abandoned claims and desperate men willing to try anything for survival. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of wilderness, making even basic necessities scarce and expensive. Medical care was virtually non-existent outside Helena, and even there, it consisted mainly of army surgeons and self-taught frontier doctors whose knowledge was limited to treating gunshot wounds and setting broken bones. It was precisely this isolation and lack of oversight that made Montana Territory attractive to certain types of settlers, those who needed to disappear from civilized society and its inconvenient questions. Into this unforgiving landscape came Patrick Donnelly and his wife Bridget, along with their 4 surviving children. Seamus, age 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and young Declan, barely 12. They arrived in Helena on a freight wagon in September 1874, their possessions carefully packed in wooden crates that suggested wealth unusual for typical Irish immigrants. Patrick presented himself as a successful potato farmer fleeing the lingering effects of the Irish famine. But his hands showed none of the calluses typical of agricultural work. Instead, his fingers bore the ink stains of a man accustomed to record keeping, and his speech carried the educated accent of someone who had received formal schooling, rare luxuries for an Irish peasant of that era. Bridget Donnelly struck observers as a woman perpetually on the edge of nervous collapse. Small-boned and prematurely aged, she rarely spoke above a whisper, and kept her children close with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Local merchants noted that she paid for supplies exclusively in gold coins, counting each one multiple times before reluctantly parting with it. Her eyes held a haunted quality that suggested she had witnessed horrors that went far beyond the typical hardships of frontier life. What the Territorial Land Office didn't know was that the Donnellys carried elaborately falsified papers from New York, claiming residence in Brooklyn for 3 years prior to their westward journey. The documents were expertly forged, complete with fake employment records and fabricated references that would have fooled all but the most thorough investigation. In reality, they had never lived in New York. They had fled directly from Ireland after a scandal that had shaken their rural community to its core. A scandal that involved the local parish priest discovering what he called an abomination against God and nature within their extended family. Father Michael O'Sullivan, a man known for his discretion regarding parishioners' private struggles, had become so horrified by what he discovered about the Donnelly family practices that he threatened immediate excommunication and exposure to British authorities. The priest's usually steady hand had trembled as he wrote his final warning to Patrick Donnelly. "What you have done in the name of bloodline purity is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Leave this parish immediately, or I will ensure that every soul in County Cork knows the true nature of your family's abominations." Patrick had purchased 160 acres of remote mountain land from the territorial government, paying in gold coins that raised no suspicions in a territory where such currency was common among former miners and prospectors. The land sat in a narrow valley between two steep ridges, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that became completely impassable during the worst winter months. The isolation was so complete that smoke from their cabin chimney couldn't be seen from any neighboring homestead, and the nearest water source, a spring-fed creek, flowed only during the brief summer months before freezing solid for nearly half the year. The location was perfect for a family that desperately needed to hide from the world, but it also presented challenges that would test even their carefully planned survival strategies. The growing season at that altitude lasted barely 4 months, requiring intensive agricultural knowledge to produce enough food for winter survival. The extreme cold could kill livestock in a single night if proper precautions weren't taken, and the psychological pressure of complete isolation for 6 months of every year had driven many frontier families to madness or suicide. Yet the Donnellys built their homestead with the efficiency of people who had faced similar challenges before. Patrick and his sons constructed a sturdy log cabin with thick walls designed to retain heat, small windows that minimized heat loss, and a complex system of interior partitions that could be sealed off during the coldest weather. The construction showed knowledge of building techniques that went beyond typical frontier skills, suggesting either previous experience with extreme climates or consultation with experts before their arrival in Montana. Bridget and the girls prepared for their first Montana winter with methodical precision that impressed even experienced mountain dwellers. They preserved meat using techniques that maximized storage space and minimized spoilage, cultivated crops specifically chosen for their ability to grow in short seasons and poor soil, and established systems for rationing supplies that showed mathematical precision unusual for supposedly uneducated Irish peasants. But neighbors who occasionally encountered them during supply runs to Helena noted peculiarities that set the Donnellys apart from other frontier families. The family members bore striking resemblances to one another that went far beyond normal family traits. Their pale blue eyes, sharp angular features, and unusually long fingers created an almost uncanny uniformity of appearance. The children displayed behavioral patterns that seemed simultaneously advanced and disturbing. They showed remarkable intelligence and self-discipline for their ages, but also a wariness around strangers and a submissiveness to parental authority that suggested fear rather than respect. Most unsettling were the conversations overheard by Jake Harrison, the territorial mail carrier who made monthly runs through the mountain settlements. The family spoke frequently in Irish Gaelic, but even when using English, their discussions contained references to maintaining the purity of the line, the strength that comes from proper breeding, and the sacrifices necessary for family advancement. These weren't the typical concerns of frontier families struggling for basic survival. They suggested deeper, more disturbing motivations for their isolated lifestyle. The first sign that something was deeply wrong with the Donnelly family emerged in March 1875, when the spring thaw finally opened the mountain passes after 6 months of complete isolation. Jake Harrison, making his first mail run since the previous October, arrived at their cabin to deliver government correspondence and immediately sensed that something terrible had happened during the long winter months. The cabin itself showed signs of recent alterations. New boards covered what appeared to be holes in the walls, fresh chinking filled gaps that suggested violence or struggle, and the area around the building bore evidence of significant digging despite the frozen ground. Most disturbing was the smell that permeated the entire homestead, a sickly sweet odor that Harrison recognized from his years of frontier experience as the lingering scent of death and decay. Bridget Donnelly met him at the door, her appearance so dramatically changed that Harrison initially didn't recognize her. The woman who had arrived in Montana just 6 months earlier as a nervous but relatively healthy frontier wife now looked haggard and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling with what appeared to be chronic anxiety. Her clothing hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight, and her hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples. When she attempted to speak, her voice cracked as if she hadn't used it in weeks. The winter was difficult, she managed to whisper, glancing nervously toward the cabin's interior. We had complications. Bridget in active labor, attended only by her teenage daughter Moira. But what he witnessed during that March afternoon would later become crucial evidence in understanding the family's dark history. The scene was orchestrated with a clinical precision that suggested extensive previous experience with similar situations. The infant that emerged was clearly malformed. Its spine curved in an unnatural S-shape, its left arm ending in a clubbed hand with only 3 fingers, and its head disproportionately large with a pronounced sloping forehead that indicated severe developmental abnormalities. The child's breathing was labored, and its cries had a weak, mewling quality that suggested internal complications beyond the visible deformities. But what disturbed Harrison most was the family's reaction to this obviously suffering infant. Rather than the grief, concern, or frantic efforts to help that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy, he observed what he later described as cold, calculated assessment in their eyes. Patrick and Bridget exchanged meaningful glances while speaking to each other in rapid Irish Gaelic that Harrison couldn't understand. Their tone suggested not surprise or anguish, but rather discussion of predetermined procedures for handling a familiar situation. The child won't survive the week, Patrick announced with clinical detachment, though the infant's breathing appeared relatively strong, and its cries, while weak, suggested basic vitality. The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate. It's God's mercy, really. Better to take them young than let them suffer. Harrison offered to ride immediately to Helena for a doctor, emphasizing that even severely deformed infants sometimes survived with proper medical care. But Patrick firmly refused, his pale blue eyes growing hard, with an authority that brooked no argument. We know how to handle our own troubles, he said, placing a possessive hand on his wife's shoulder. It's the Lord's will that some children aren't meant for this world. Interfering with divine judgment would be a sin against nature itself. The religious justification struck Harrison as rehearsed, as if Patrick had delivered similar explanations many times before. There was also an underlying threat in his tone that suggested serious consequences for anyone who might interfere with the family's private handling of the situation. Seamus and young Declan, who had been working outside during the birth, returned to the cabin with expressions that showed no surprise at finding their mother in labor or their newest sibling obviously deformed, suggesting this wasn't the first such birth they had witnessed. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later with routine mail delivery, the infant was gone. Bridget met him at the door with red-rimmed but completely dry eyes, the look of someone who had exhausted their capacity for grief rather than someone experiencing fresh loss. Lost the baby 3 days after you left, she reported in a voice devoid of emotion. Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way. Her phrase, next to the others, sent chills through Harrison's spine. Behind the cabin, he now noticed for the first time, stood a row of small wooden crosses marking fresh-turned earth. He counted 4 graves, all too small for adult burials, all marked with crude dates spanning the past 8 months. The implications were staggering. The Donnellys had lost multiple infants during their first year in Montana, losses that had never been reported to territorial authorities as required by law. The graves themselves looked wrong to Harrison's experienced eye. The dirt was disturbed in a pattern that suggested systematic planning rather than random tragedy. They were arranged in a neat row that left space for additional burials. That summer, as Harrison continued his monthly mail runs, he began paying careful attention to the Donnelly family dynamics. What he observed gradually painted a picture of a household operating under rules and pressures that had nothing to do with typical frontier survival. The children moved with the careful precision of people who knew that mistakes carried severe consequences, and their interactions with each other showed patterns of communication that suggested shared knowledge of family secrets too dangerous to discuss openly. Moira and Colleen, despite being only 17 and 15, carried themselves with the knowledge and wariness of much older women. They handled domestic tasks with efficiency that went beyond normal teenage competence, but their eyes held a haunted quality that suggested they had witnessed things that fundamentally changed their understanding of family relationships. When they spoke to their parents, their voices carried a deference that seemed rooted in fear rather than respect. Seamus, the eldest son at 19, had developed a pronounced stutter that seemed to worsen whenever his father was present. He flinched at sudden movements and avoided eye contact with anyone outside the immediate family. Most disturbing was his reaction to questions about family life. He would begin to respond normally, then catch himself and fall silent, as if remembering consequences for revealing family information. Young Declan appeared the most normal of the children, but Harrison caught him once, staring at the small cemetery behind the cabin with an expression of terror rather than sadness. When asked about his deceased siblings, the boy had responded, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." The child had immediately clapped his hand over his mouth, as if realizing he had said something forbidden, and refused to speak another word during Harrison's entire visit. Most disturbing were the conversations Harrison sometimes overheard when approaching the cabin quietly through the forest. The family spoke frequently about keeping the line pure, maintaining the strength of the blood, and the sacrifices our ancestors made to preserve what matters. They used Irish phrases that Harrison couldn't translate, but the tone suggested rituals or traditions that went far beyond normal family customs. There were references to the others back home, what happened to the weak ones, and most chillingly, discussions of which children show the signs and how to handle the imperfect ones. These conversations painted a picture of a family operating according to beliefs and practices that predated their arrival in Montana by many years, possibly generations. The isolated mountain homestead wasn't just a refuge from civilization. It was a carefully chosen location where the family could continue traditions that would be impossible to maintain under the scrutiny of normal community life. As 1875 progressed into its harsh winter months, the Donnelly family's isolation became complete once again. Snow blocked the mountain passes from November through March, cutting them off entirely from the outside world for the second time since their arrival in Montana territory. But it was during this second period of isolation that the true nature of their genetic legacy began to manifest in ways that would eventually draw the attention of territorial authorities and shock even the frontier's hardened residents. Dr. Theodore Brennan, the territorial physician who would later investigate the family, had arrived in Helena in October 1875, carrying with him medical texts and knowledge that represented the cutting edge of hereditary science. A graduate of the University of Vienna, with additional training in Berlin and Edinburgh, Brennan had studied under physicians who were just beginning to understand the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. His medical library contained works by Francis Galton and other pioneers of what would later become known as genetics, giving him knowledge that wouldn't become common medical understanding for decades to come. Brennan had come to Montana territory not for adventure or profit, but to escape a professional scandal in Europe. His research into hereditary traits had led him to conclusions about human breeding that his colleagues found disturbing, and his vocal support for controlled reproduction to improve the human species had made him persona non grata in respectable medical circles. The frontier offered him anonymity and the freedom to pursue his scientific interests without institutional oversight. Ironically, the same freedom that had attracted the Donnelly family for their own disturbing purposes. During the winter of 1875-1876, Brennan received his first hint that something was seriously amiss in the mountain valleys when Jake Harrison arrived at his Helena office in February, having risked the dangerous winter trail to seek medical consultation. Harrison described phenomena that defied his 8 years of experience in the Montana wilderness. Strange lights seen coming from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours of the night, smoke patterns that suggested fires being burned at unusual times and temperatures, and most disturbing of all, sounds that carried across the frozen landscape during the still winter nights. "Doctor," Harrison said, his weathered face creased with worry and confusion, "I've been carrying mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between normal frontier hardship and something genuinely wrong. What I'm hearing from that cabin in the dead of winter, it's not the sound of people dealing with ordinary troubles. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops so suddenly it's like someone threw a switch. And there's singing, if you can call it that doesn't sound quite human. The melody is wrong, like it's meant for voices that don't work the same way ours do." Harrison also reported visual phenomena that troubled his practical frontier sensibilities. The Donnelly cabin showed lights burning at times when fuel conservation should have been critical for winter survival. The patterns of illumination suggested activities requiring sustained light during the darkest hours of night, activities that didn't match normal family routines. Most disturbing were the occasions when Harrison glimpsed figures moving outside the cabin during blizzard conditions that should have made outdoor activity impossible. Figures that seemed unusually tall or moved with gaits that didn't look entirely human in the shifting snow and shadows. Brennan's medical instincts were immediately aroused by Harrison's descriptions, but the winter weather made any journey to the Donnelly homestead absolutely impossible. The mountain passes were blocked by snow depths that made travel suicidal, and even if he could have reached the cabin, winter emergency visits were typically requested only for life-threatening situations that couldn't wait for spring. The Donnelly family had never requested medical assistance despite the obvious health problems Harrison had described. Instead of attempting a dangerous winter journey, Brennan began researching Irish immigration records and territorial archives, looking for any available information about the family's background and previous medical history. What he discovered raised more questions than answers and painted a picture of systematic deception that suggested the family's problems went far deeper than simple frontier hardship. The Donnellys had claimed to be from County Cork, Ireland, fleeing poverty and crop failures that affected rural Irish communities throughout the 1860s and early 1870s. Their immigration papers contained detailed stories about lost relatives, destroyed farms, and economic circumstances that forced them to seek opportunities in America. But careful cross-referencing of their claims with official Irish parish records revealed inconsistencies that strongly suggested elaborate falsification. The listed relatives in Ireland couldn't be verified through church baptismal and marriage records that normally provided reliable genealogical information. The described farm locations didn't match existing land ownership records from County Cork. Most troubling, the stated reasons for emigration, crop failures and poverty, didn't match the significant amount of gold the family had used to purchase their Montana property, pay for transcontinental transportation, and establish their isolated homestead. More disturbing were reports Brennan found buried in New York immigration files, documents that immigration officials had apparently failed to follow up properly. A family named Donnelly had indeed passed through Ellis Island in 1874, but they had been flagged by medical inspectors for concerning physical characteristics among the children that suggested possible genetic abnormalities. The medical report described signs of developmental irregularities consistent with hereditary defects and noted that the parents had become increasingly aggressive and evasive when questioned about their family medical history. The immigration medical inspector, Dr. Samuel Morrison, had recommended that the family be detained for extended medical evaluation, but his report had been overruled by administrative officials eager to process the large numbers of immigrants passing through Ellis Island daily. Morrison's notes suggested that his concerns went beyond simple medical abnormalities. He had observed behavioral patterns in the family that suggested systematic concealment of information relevant to public health and safety. As Brennan delved deeper into available records, he discovered references to Irish families named Donnelly in other American communities, families that had arrived at different times but showed similar patterns of behavior. A Donnelly family in Pennsylvania had attracted attention from local authorities in 1871 for unusually high infant mortality rates. Another Donnelly family in Ohio had been investigated by county officials in 1873 for possible child neglect, though the investigation had been dropped when the family suddenly relocated without leaving forwarding information. The pattern suggested that the Montana Donnellys weren't isolated criminals, but part of a larger network of related families who shared similar practices and moved frequently to avoid official scrutiny. The implications were staggering. If these were all branches of the same extended family, their genetic manipulation and systematic infanticide might have been practiced across multiple states and involved dozens of victims over many years. As spring approached and the mountain passes began to clear, Brennan found himself increasingly obsessed with the mystery of the Donnelly family. His professional training told him that isolated populations often developed genetic problems due to limited breeding pools, a well-documented phenomenon in remote communities throughout history. But something about this particular family suggested a pattern far more deliberate and systematic than simple geographic isolation could explain. The combination of Harrison's disturbing observations, the suspicious immigration records, and the evidence of possible connections to similar families in other states convinced Brennan that the Donnellys represented something unprecedented in his medical experience. A family that had deliberately chosen to pursue genetic experimentation on themselves, regardless of the consequences for their children or the broader community. When the spring thaw of 1876 finally opened the mountain trails, Dr. Brennan made the decision to visit the Donnelly homestead personally, ostensibly to provide routine medical services to an isolated frontier family. What he found there would fundamentally change his understanding of human nature, genetic science, and the lengths to which people would go to preserve family secrets that spanned multiple generations. The journey to the Donnelly cabin required a full day of difficult travel through terrain that seemed deliberately chosen for its inaccessibility. The trail wound through dense forests, across unstable creek beds, and up steep mountain slopes that would have challenged even experienced horsemen. The isolation was so complete that Brennan encountered no other travelers, no signs of other homesteads, and no evidence that anyone else had used the trail in months. The cabin itself appeared deceptively normal from the outside, well-built, well-maintained, with signs of careful farming and successful animal husbandry that suggested a family adapting well to frontier life. The immediate surroundings showed evidence of hard work and intelligent land use. Carefully tended vegetable gardens, efficient livestock shelters, and water management systems that demonstrated sophisticated agricultural knowledge. But Brennan's medically trained eye immediately noticed troubling details that most visitors would have overlooked. The family cemetery behind the cabin contained far too many graves for a family that claimed to have lost only occasional infants to the harsh frontier conditions. Brennan counted 11 wooden crosses, all marking plots that were clearly too small for adult burials, all carved with dates that showed deaths occurring at suspiciously regular intervals, rather than the random clustering typical of epidemic disease or severe weather casualties. The graves themselves were arranged in neat rows that suggested systematic planning, rather than desperate responses to unexpected tragedies. More disturbing was the evidence of recent expansion in the cemetery area. Fresh tool marks in the surrounding trees and recently moved earth suggested that additional grave sites were being prepared in advance. Preparations that implied the family expected future deaths rather than hoping to avoid them. The crosses marking existing graves showed similar construction and weathering patterns, as if they had been made in batches rather than individually crafted for each deceased child. Patrick Donnelly met him at the cabin door with a mixture of frontier hospitality and barely concealed wariness that immediately set Brennan's professional instincts on edge. The family patriarch had aged dramatically since Harrison's descriptions from the previous year. His hair had gone completely white, despite his apparent age of 45, and deep lines creased his face in patterns that suggested chronic stress rather than normal aging. His hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, and his eyes held a haunted quality that Brennan recognized from patients suffering from severe psychological trauma. "We don't need a doctor here," Patrick said with forced firmness, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "We've always handled our own troubles, just as our families did in the old country. Bringing outsiders into family matters only complicates situations that are better resolved through traditional methods." Bridget appeared behind her husband, and Brennan was shocked by the extent of her physical deterioration since Harrison's previous descriptions. The woman who had given birth just over a year earlier now looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, her frame so thin that her clothing hung like drapes over protruding bones. Her hands showed a constant tremor that could have indicated neurological problems, chronic malnutrition, or psychological stress severe enough to cause physical symptoms. When she attempted to speak, Patrick silenced her with a sharp look that suggested years of practiced dominance and consequences for disobedience that went beyond normal marital authority. But it was the children who provided the most disturbing evidence of the family's dark secrets and abnormal lifestyle. Moira, now 18, was clearly pregnant again. Her condition advanced enough to suggest conception during the isolated winter months when no outsiders could have been present. The implications of this timing, combined with the family's isolation and unusual genetic patterns, raised questions that Brennan found professionally and personally disturbing. Colleen, now 16, showed signs of premature physical development that seemed accelerated beyond her chronological age. Her adult features appeared fully formed in ways that suggested hormonal abnormalities, possibly related to genetic factors or environmental influences. More troubling was her behavior around her parents. She displayed a combination of maturity and submissiveness that suggested experiences inappropriate for someone her age. Most disturbing was young Declan, now 13, who had developed pronounced physical abnormalities since Harrison's previous visits. The boy's facial features showed clear asymmetry, with one side of his face appearing normally developed, while the other showed signs of arrested growth or malformation. He walked with a pronounced limp that suggested spinal curvature, and his hands showed the elongated fingers and unusual joint flexibility that Brennan recognized as possible indicators of genetic connective tissue disorders. During his brief initial visit, Brennan observed family dynamics that defied normal social conventions and suggested psychological pressures that went far beyond typical frontier hardships. The older children deferred to their parents with a combination of fear and resignation that indicated consequences for disobedience far more severe than normal parental discipline. Their movements were careful and calculated, as if they had learned through experience that spontaneous behavior could trigger unpredictable and dangerous responses. Seamus, the eldest son at 20, avoided eye contact with both his parents